Chapter 17. Assassination of Prince Rosen. On the other side, Gajradhan and Ulkasur commenced to weave a strong strategy against King Vajraveer by compounding neighboring armies into theirs. Perhaps they were so unsure of their victory standing only by each other's trust against such renowned dynasty. They embarked into all potential Ryans and kingdoms and compelled them to join them in the war against Surishla Empire. However, none of the domains showed any of their interests in standing against King Vajraveer, who had always been a considerate neighbor and surpassing help during all natural calamities and impulsive attacks. They did try their best to stick to their core dharma and ideology, but then were coarsely bound to do so. And those of a greedy demeanor effortlessly got lured by a grant of a share of treasure as well as commanding certain parts of captured sovereignty. The kings were offered no third option than the two. However, Ulkasur didn't rest only on the regime of armed forces. He now had to gather more strength from powerful forces and spirits through the dark art to expand his necromancy by the worship of Ma Bhadrakali. He went near a large dark cave with his nephew Gajradhan and asked him to seal the mouth of the cave with the largest round rock after he went into it. "Wake me not for the following 7 days. Keep your spirits high and have faith in the laws of the dark cryptic trances. I shall come to see you soon. Meet me on the same spot on the 7th day from where I leave you today," he said, and disappeared momentarily into the precipitous darkness of the fathomless trenches. He sealed himself into that large dark cave for 7 days, dedicating himself thoroughly to perform the most malignant rituals and deliver disastrous diabolism. On the 7th day, when it was partially dusky, Gajradhan went near the cave and stood on the same rock where he had left from after seeing his uncle the last time. He was impatiently waiting for him to come back as a small child craving for his favorite toy right before its arrival. Suddenly, to his bewilderment, the mouth of the cave burst open with a thunderous thud, breaking the largest round rock apart into millions of tiny solid pieces, and a shadow appeared behind the dusty smog. He seemed to achieve what he coveted after all dwelling formalities were fully accomplished as he rustled out of the cave with a queer aroma of dominance. He looked just so whimsically strong. He was always taken as the weirdest and diminutive person, but at that moment, every ounce of him was either a compact bone or strongest muscle. Gajradhan's lips stretched wider into a gaping grin, and his eyebrows arched for the sky at the very sight. "Ah, he has made it. He's back." He stared at him in awe, wondering on how so fragile and petite could achieve so enormous level of such expertise. "Undoubtedly, he is the master of all games," he thought, and in the flashes of moments that follow, he could feel his uncle's robust arms spreading around him, squeezing him tight, and his arms reciprocating. The dark duo submerged in the darkness of that night, leaving for their palace. Gajradhan was now cocksure of their victory in the warfare. Nevertheless, Ulkasur wouldn't like to leave a single uncertainty that would fall their path. Thenceforth, he would keep trying to enervate their rivals in some or the other way, pondering over the worst in the best way. "I can smell the winds hovering from the lands of Surishila. Is it the signal that I am going to walk them as their ruler very soon?" asked Gajradhan in one of his shallow, childish way while he stood on the roof of their palace facing the direction of Surishila. Ulkasur stared at him, gruesomely being upset at his self-indulgent rush. "We should refrain from acting like a bird in a cage that can never see the world outside the bars and thus assumes that she would die of hunger and thirst if she flees away from it? Keep your desires intact and think beyond the boundaries of land." Gajradhan looked back perplexed at his derisive statement, at which Ulkasur couldn't abstain from explaining further as he read the best how much detailing his dim-witted nephew needed for everything he would clue about. "We must not sit or relax before the war is over, my dear boy. There are more to execute, more to work upon, and more to conclude," chided Ulkasur at Gajradhan's easement. "Now the time has arrived when I should unfurl one of the most crucial tricks of my secrets. And we must do it at this very time, with no further delay." Ulkasur's arcane words seemed to spiral into something devastating of his calamitous prospectuses. He looked so demonic that the darkness of his eyes seemed to swallow the scarlet horizon. The last flickering light of dissolving sunbeam winged out momentarily, merging with evolving shadows of fright, like a scared bird sinking into its nest before the dark hour that completely enfolds the nature, leaving it lifeless. Even the wind slackened for a while, as if unwilling to blow without his permission. He swung around, swirling like a swift serpent, to face Gajradhan, who looked so baffled at his uncle's proclamation that it looked that his face would fall off. Ulkasur placed his hand on his shoulder and dragged him so closer that the pupils of their eyes mirrored each other's. And then he finally uttered the words of fury, buzzing out loud to his ears. "You must weaken down the lady first." "The lady?" asked Gajradhan, totally rattled at Ulkasur's rational remarks. "Yes, the lady who caused you the biggest harm," Ulkasur replied. "Biggest harm? What harm you refer to? Who you exactly want to point? Please speak of it precise and neat." Gajradhan here expected Ulkasur to be straight, rather playing around with the words. "The biggest harm I refer to has caused an extreme pain in your heart, stolen away your peace, and given you sleepless night, my boy." Now he was clear as crystal in his indications. Gajradhan could now well infer what his uncle exactly meant and whom he had referring to. His face was red with suppressed rage. He puffed blatantly and gritted teeth from an effort to remain silent. Ulkasur smiled in contentment as he found his nephew finally responding to his clues. "Do I have to kill her?" asked Gajradhan, finally breaking his deep, heavy breath. "You need not do that for now. There will be no fun left then. Kill her pride, crush her esteem, and weaken her too in her heart first, so it becomes a challenge for her even to stand before you on the battlefield," replied Ulkasur. His blotting words were a clear sign of his own hatred for Madhavi than any concern for his nephew's lost prestige. However, it was obscure for Gajradhan's big haughty head to be able to read it. "How should I do that? What should fittingly be done to slay her weakness?" asked Gajradhan. "Her weakness lies in her esteem for her kith and kin, for the kingdom, and on top of all, in her undue fidelity of her insane mate, for whom he also clings to an undue obligation, and that is his security to her hands. Crush the witless worm to thaw the metal of the maiden," suggested Ulkasur with clear hints for who he wanted Gajradhan to slay. Gajradhan was, however, yet skeptical on how to go about propounding with the exacted course. "I will send the best of our men to accomplish the task. This time I would make sure they don't come barehanded," Gajradhan replied. But Ulkasur censored his foolish ideas insistingly with a firm objection. He scowled at him defiantly and said, The lives are at stake, and you really get to wake. We have no time for witnessing another rout, and it's high time you should realize this. This task has to be performed by you and only you and no one else, because the pain is felt by you. Since you know it better, so you will deal it with better. Therefore, it should be your retribution by your hands. Gajradhan, though moderately influenced, but still panicked at this assertion of his devious uncle. He floundered about hither and thither, uttering, "But how? How is it possible to enter a palace girdled with high security from all the fronts?" Ulkasur retorted, "Calm down and listen to me a little sound." He then drew out a charm weaved in a mystic knot and entrenched with a small balanced silver medallion, hung it around Gajradhan's neckband, and said, "You would be able to break through all the boundaries and securities with the help of this miraculous charm. Go tonight and endow the conquest. But be sure of to let bare your face under the first ray of sunrise to the lady before you leave." His cast was one of an absolute disdain as he explained upon the phrase. His thoughts filled with loathing. Following this, he started to mumble something fast, as in plunging into deep chanting with a burning grace on his face, and then placed his hands on Gajradhan's eyes. After a while, as he removed his hands, his eyes were as immobile as the rest of his face. He smirked into his arrogant triumph for the attempted transformation of his nephew into Rajyavedya, the physician who had the charge for curing Rohan. "Leave without delay and seal the doom of that worthless wretch before the first ray of sun, since the spell expires until then." Disguised as Rajvedya and endorsed with manic superhuman power, Gajradhan sat on horseback to take off for the kingdom of his dream and desires. His swarthy tinted stallion galloped far above the ground through grassy beloved by long dense bushes, impending towards their destination with implausible speed. Forthwith, the masked monster reached the palace. He stood in front of towering gates, clothed in his long-drawn coal-black cloak under the evil dark shadows. The gate guards, partly intimidated by his evil appearance, inquired with the arms unimpaired in their hands, "Who are you to have arrived at the palace of a glorious empire at this hour?" asked one of the guards. Gajradhan had ascertained reasonably well that he did not have to be offensive at that moment in time. He casually removed the wheeling hood from his face and threw the cloak on one of the guard's shoulders. He yanked out a small pocket from his waist belt and scooped out some twigs and leaves to show to guards and said, "Prince needs to be given those herbs tonight. They bloom open only in the night and bear their effects till only before sunrise. Every moment's delay is precarious for it, so don't delay and let me in." All watchmen bowed in respect for him in recognition of Rajvedya's facade and voice, and then opened the gates. The relative incidents boosted his confidence that his sly disguise, he would face no difficulty in advancing attempts as well. He further approached towards Prince Rohan's chamber. As he made his moves, it seemed people wouldn't care to question his presence, hence letting the entire way clear for him. He strode down the passages and soon was standing in front of the room. He slowly pushed the thick metal coating and swung the iron-bound door marginally open to sneak a peek to check on any security inside, but favorably, nothing beamed in his sight. He then slowly slid to the margin to shift fully inside the room. He was formless and indistinct, like a piece of shadow shifting. To his utter astonishment, Queen Balakrishna was spotted sitting by Rohan's side, lulling him for sleep, intoning her most pleasing words for her son. You are my precious and the dearest. In this storm, in this wind that howls, you are the gentle center. And so I come to rest at your side. I promise to be there always. She held his hand to her cheek and said, I would never let my precious pleasure subside in any melancholy, and no matter what came, I would protect you, even to the tooth of death. At the same course of time, Madhavi was deeply drenched into her meditation in sanctorium, her routine place for worship where she would spend almost all of her evenings. And especially on no-moon nights, she had been sitting deep in meditation with her eyes closed for the entire night, intact in her powerful trance. All of a sudden, she grew too restless to sit still and paced, breaking away from her rituals. Salty drops invaded her forehead as her skin was glinting with a heated wave behind her neck, which was damp as she moved about her nape. A queer stroke of commotion pounded into her heart and she felt an urge to wake, run and escape. She brusquely opened her eyes, got up and rushed toward her chamber. There, Gajradhan wanted to waste no time as commanded by his unscrupulous uncle. He conjured up the entire scene in a jiffy by advancing oblivious to attack Rosen, sleeping in his bed next to his mother, who was sitting and luring her son in utter love and affection. Balakrishna, dazed at Rajvaidya's sudden arrival, got paralyzed at the moment, staring aghast at him. Before she could question his abrupt presence, Gajradhan, disguised as Vaidya, rode roughshod over her royal denomination and grabbed her tight by her arm and tossed her away from her son. She fell on her front right on the floor. He brutally slit sleeping prince's throat with a sharp steel sword, leaving Balakrishna shrieking awfully. There was just the running of blood and a slumped form hanging by the wooden edge. Madhavi, sweeping across the all-embracing corridor, reached the doorway. She stumbled as the door swung open with a fierce blow by her wide-open palms and then burst into only to sight the most horrid view. She was white as a lifeless statue standing benumbed at the entrance of her chamber. Her eyes and her mouth were frozen wide open in an expression of stunned revelation. Her frail, blanched body, half hung on the brass knob of the door, looked almost dead like the last leaf in autumn. Her only movement was a trembling of her limbs and a hammering heart inside her breast, and although she was staring straight, she appeared not to notice the assassin at all, but her gaze fixed only at the body of her dead husband engulfed in the pool of blood. Gajradhan, in the guise of Vaidya, glaring menacingly at Madhavi, gave a nasty, cruel grin on the despicable act committed on her husband. "You are late, lady." He viciously made a jibe about her being in helpless state, staring into her black, cold eyes. Perhaps it was an attempt to drag her attention towards him to show what had happened was just the outcome of her own arrogant attitude and pompous demeanor. Madhavi slowly shifted her gaze towards him, but could not move for a fleck as her heart fell invariably silent. Everything seemed slowed and wobbled in motion while she stood confounded at what might have caused a healer to kill his own subject. As if able to read her mind, he looked deep into her eyes, getting a little closer than before. His hands deliberately reached out to the charm dangling around his neck. With swelling knuckles, he gripped it tight in his blood-stained palm and then broke it open to unveil who he really was. Lurking in the dark shadows of flapping drapings, his hair slicked back away from his hardened features, allowing the first ray of sun getting absorbed into the evil glint in his eyes. He finally appeared before her as Gajradhan. Madhavi was astounded. It was as if the impact had knocked every wisp of air from her lungs as she lay there struggling even to inhale. However, no struggle to understand the intentions was required, but his presence was enough to raise 1,000 doubts and fears. It was evenly unbelieved for Balakrishna to trust her eyes witnessing her own son-in-law murdering her son. She placed her hand on her chest in utter shock and collapsed again on the ground with hands by the ground and her head hanging above them. The pain came out like an uproar from her throat in the form of silent scream first, then in a sudden shrill cry as a burst of deep grief, like the walls tumbled down brick by brick on a sudden rage of a broken dam hauled by the great strains of waters behind them. Sensing the danger following her wailing, Gajradhan threw the charm, dashing it against the ground. It created impenetrable smog all around him as his broken charm hit the ground, granting him to perish effortlessly from the sights of both the ladies. Guards scooped around following Balakrishna's scream, worthlessly in vain as they couldn't sight anyone about the entire view. King Vajraveer, Vishnukarma and Rudra followed the arms, but all efforts were abortive howsoever they would try. The king sat there by his wife, dominated by a profound sadness. Rudra called housewomen to take Madhavi away from the sight, while Vishnukarma covered the corpse of the charming prince with a sheet, with pearl-like beads dropping down his cheeks as bidding the last farewell he had accustomed of ahead of time.